Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're watching a special edition of The Listening Post. This week, we're going to do something a little bit different from our usual year-ender. We asked our team of producers to each pick the feature story they most enjoyed working on this year. So Will Young takes a look at the citizen journalism revolution in the news business, how user-generated content makes its way into the papers and onto television screens. Next up will be Israel, where Flo Phillips scrutinizes a trend that has more and more journalists running for parliament. The transition is not one that everyone can make. Our resident Latin American, Marcela Pizarro, then explores the politics behind Colombia's latest telenovela, a soap opera about narco-trafficking. We'll look back at a media story in the Philippines that we put on the air just before that country was hit by Typhoon Haiyan. Meenakshi Ravi examines the dangers of being a reporter there. And finally, Nick Muirhead on what we call the usual suspects, those ubiquitous talking heads who keep popping up on all kinds of different news stories, offering punchy sound bites, but not necessarily expertise. We've had to cut these pieces down to fit them into one program, but they will give you a feel for some of the media-related subjects the Listening Post tackled in 2013. Our starting point is Syria, a piece produced by Gauri Sharma on the freelance journalists, covering a story that more and more staff reporters are turning down because of the dangers involved.
Syria, 2013. Here are just some of the images that ran in mainstream media over the past year. However, none of the photographers who took the pictures work exclusively for the outlets they featured in. This shot of the rebel siege of Aleppo in 2012 was taken by Mexican Javier Manzano for the Agence France-Presse. It earned him a Pulitzer Prize. These images, capturing the human cost of the conflict, were taken for the Associated Press by Spanish freelancer Manu Bravo. And The Guardian ran these photos by Spanish journalist Maisun last year. But stories like this come at a price. The latest figures from the Paris-based Reporters Without Borders show that at least 60 reporters are missing or detained in the country. As the dangers mount, more and more staff journalists are turning down assignments in Syria, relying on freelancers to accept the jobs.
I've compared freelancers in war zones to garment workers in Bangladesh. There's a demand for sneakers, and there are garment workers who are willing to be paid very little money to produce shoes in unsafe conditions. I mean, it's supply meets demand. The freelancer is getting paid, the editor's getting their story, and the public's getting their news. It's just not happening in a safe way.
In Syria, I mean, if you cover the regime side or if you cover the rebel side, in the end it's the same. You're simply a foreigner. You have nobody to rely upon if something happens.
Italian-born journalist Francesca Bori should know. Bori has spent the last 2 years covering Syria for Italian outlets. Back in July, she wrote a scathing critique on how the mainstream media treats those working on a freelance basis. She described freelancers as second-class journalists who get paid meagre wages.
In an ideal world, the freelancers would be paid a lot more money. I think there are examples of freelancers being sent into situations, into conflicts, where either they're not adequately trained, protected, or necessarily particularly well insured. It's not an ideal world because finances are so stretched, which people going to conflict zones, in Syria in particular, should be fully aware of.
It's complicated because if a freelance isn't being controlled or employed or engaged on commission, surely the industry shouldn't have a responsibility if they don't have the control.
Economics has become part of the problem, as shrinking newsroom budgets and journalists losing jobs means media outlets are relying more on independent journalists. But on Syria, the industry has taken unusual steps to discourage freelancers from covering the war. Earlier this year, a handful of British papers, including The Times, The Independent, The Guardian and The Observer, said they would no longer accept submissions from stringers. The work was just too dangerous. But the freelance community does have some support from organisations like the Frontline Freelancers Register and the Rory Peck Trust. Both are London-based and offer assistance, training, and in the case of Syria, advice. Back in August, the Roy Peck Trust issued a statement asking reporters to seriously consider turning down assignments in the country. So the next time you see a picture from Syria, double-check the photo credit and spare a thought for the freelancer who took it. If not for the freelancers, the lengths they go to and the risks they take, these are the stories that would go untold.
User-generated content, UGC, has come a long way from letters to the editor. The power to create news content has turned anyone with a smartphone into a potential journalist, and audiences are increasingly aware of their own changing role.
You just need to look back over the last 12, 18 months and see the massive news events that would not have been able to be covered the way they are without the contribution of citizens. It's gone from something that was perceived as almost a necessary evil used sparingly to a very established part of media news content that's been put out.
Ordinary citizens seem to instinctively realise that they have the power to actually effect change or influence information, and I think for us as a news organisation it's very much trying to figure out, you know, what is this relationship, this connection with the audience.
The shopping centre siege in Nairobi in September showed yet again that amateurs can deliver news images that mainstream media are in no position to capture. But it remains up to the professionals to know when to incorporate it and where to draw the line. When bombs exploded at the Boston Marathon back in April, newsrooms were caught up in a stampede of citizen content and journalistic values were trampled underfoot.
Julia, we're getting some conflicting reports about an arrest.
The misreporting and rumors that came out from citizen reports of the Boston bombings were actually quite alarming. But I think what's interesting about that is mainstream media also made a number of mistakes and missteps and were ahead of themselves in the reporting. And so it's not just the citizen journalists that made mistakes.
For many media organisations, the shifting landscape between their output and their audience is unfamiliar ground. Bringing order to this uncharted territory is a new generation of user-generated content middlemen, companies like Demotics and Newsflare, working with citizen reporters to get them the best deal for their photos and videos.
Where Demotics first made a splash was in 2009 and the back of the elections in Iran, when news organisations were restricted, Reuters were unable to shoot there. There was a boom with regards to the use of social media, pictures being put up on places like Facebook, Twitter and Flickr and what have you. What we tried to do was to harness that and getting in touch with those people on the ground in Iran.
The key difference that Newsflare makes for established news organisations is that we identify the signal from the noise. There's reduced friction at both ends, both in terms of the contributor and the publisher and broadcaster that buys the clip, so that the public gets to see that really meaningful content quickly.
The spread of technology means that an eyewitness with a smartphone will almost always be where news is breaking long before the professionals arrive. And an audience with the power to deliver content to newsrooms means that journalists, producers and the organisations they work for have to adapt to a new media landscape, one that puts user-generated content at the heart of the news production cycle.
More and more people have mobile phones, more and more people have instant access to the recording of instant history in a way and a scale that has never before been seen. So that makes everybody a potential journalist, or at least everybody potentially able to commit what we might call an act of journalism.
Throughout Israel's relatively short history, media and politics have been closely intertwined. Perhaps never more so than in the current crop of journalists turned politicians, sworn into the 19th Knesset. A bunch of polished MKs who have applied the well-honed communication skills they learned in the field of journalism to another field, politics.
What happened in the last 10 years is that this objective, independent media has changed its nature. and the Israeli journalists became very much opinionated.
In 20 years, we saw the rise of the journalist or media person as a celeb. And once that happened, party politics went down and personal politics, popularity politics went up. So the two things merged in a way and gave rise to the possibility that a journalist or media person who is a celeb could go quickly and efficiently into politics, and that is definitely evident with Yair Lapid.
Lapid has made the move to politics look easy. But take a look at this. Back in 2005, he interviewed another journalist turned politician.
האם שווה לזרוק קריירה תקשורתית כל כך מצליחה בשביל כל הגועל נפש הזה?
Then he did exactly the same thing. Lapid gave up his anchor chair, formed his own party, and ran for prime minister.
Many journalists spend their careers covering, analysing, skewering Israel's politicians, sometimes even skewing what they say. Clearly, they consider journalism the ideal training ground for politics. They think they know how politics works, but do they really? Does knowing the Knesset from the outside really prepare one to work on the inside?
Absolutely not. And I can tell you that because I was a journalist and I became involved in politics.
It's moving from being a spectator to being an actor. I have written extensively for 25 years. I thought, maybe naively, that by moving to the action, I would change the face of Israel, which turned out to be wrong. It's not as easy as I thought.
It didn't work for Daniel Ben-Simon, but that has done nothing to deter other media types from invading the Knesset. The line between politics and journalism is becoming increasingly blurred, and as more and more people cross it, the Fourth Estate in Israel is facing questions on its role as a check on power.
When Sheli Yachimowicz interviewed Amir Peretz, who was then the head of labor in 2006, and about 2 months later, he welcomed her into the Labour Party. So people said the interview was, very soft and very complimenting because she was already planning her move into politics.
איך התחושה להפוך בן לילה לסוג של יקיר תקשורת בשיא הטרנד?
Now there's distrust and basically I think it's a positive thing.
Obviously, when a journalist moves to politics, he hurts his own profession. Because they say you have a hidden agenda. That's why journalists and politicians are the least trusted professions in Israel.
In Israel, today's journalists are tomorrow's politicians. It's a revolving door, although most of the traffic seems to be heading in one direction, in search of power.
For years, the Colombian TV soap opera, the telenovela, has been a staple for television viewers around Latin America. Cinderella storylines, melodramatic close-ups, the long episodic build-ups to the happily ever after. But that narrative, rehashed and rerun, got old, and audiences got tired. Then came the narconovela, slick, glamorous thrillers on the Colombian drugs world.
Soy Pedro Pablo León Jaramillo.
A genre revamped, topping the ratings and exported around the Spanish-speaking continent. This year, one narco-novela sparked a new kind of controversy.
Tres Caínes.
Because the story went to the heart of Colombia's painful political history. Los Tres Caínes, the Three Cains, tells the story of the Castaño brothers, the real-life founders of one of Colombia's most notorious paramilitary groups. Set up to fight left-wing guerrillas, they killed thousands, were knee-deep in drugs trafficking, often with the blessing of the country's political elite. But the drama doesn't sit well with journalists who've tried to tell the real story.
The problem is that the Castaño brothers are presented as heroes. Their evil sides are shown too, that's true.
But those of us who have made films know perfectly well that the public end up feeling more sympathetic towards those who are on screen the most.
Estos guerrilleros son el cáncer de este país, señores. Y nosotros los castaños nos vamos a encargar de exterminarlos.
When a story so complicated is told in such large brushstrokes, the story tends to get distorted and the murderers end up legitimized.
De justificación.
Cuando hay críticas, uno tiene que escuchar. When there is criticism, we have to listen to it. And some people told me they felt underrepresented and that I should have given the victim's point of view. But there's no way the channel would have bought that, because they want to use famous figures already etched on the Colombian psyche. If I'd have pitched a series about a peasant called Alfonso Gomez, who was murdered or displaced, it would have been rejected, because it doesn't have the same resonance as the Tres Caínes.
The job of fiction writers is to engage us, so they use storytelling devices. They take dramatic license, they exaggerate, if necessary, and edit things out to draw us in. It's the job of the news media to tell the true story. The problem is that news outlets in Colombia have often shied away from thoroughly covering all sides of what for Colombians has been the country's defining conflict.
These channels are taking advantage of a political story to produce narco dramas. And they're forgetting to respect the dignity of the victims. When it comes to historical memory in this country, we demand a socially responsible media, because what's at stake are the rights of the victims and the fight for transitional justice to pave the way to peace.
With a slew of narco-novellas in production, that seems unlikely. So for the time being, this genre will carry on being the other Colombian export that's not necessarily all that good for you.
If one was to guess where the worst case of a mass murder of journalists took place, countries like Iraq, Somalia, and Syria might come to mind. It's the Philippines. In late 2009, 58 people traveling as part of a politician's convoy were killed. 34 of them were journalists. 4 years on, there have been no convictions. And during this year, 7 journalists have been murdered.
Doing stories about criminal acts, about corruption in government or in collaboration with private sector or in any other sector can really put you in danger being a journalist.
The Philippines is a unique case. I think we have a very robust democracy, a very noisy press. I think we're the freest in Southeast Asia. At the same time, we're not a model for what good journalism is all about, because we have journalists are being killed.
The current president, Benigo Aquino III, says his government is working overtime to prevent new cases of human rights violations and to resolve previous cases. But it's not helping.
The University of the Philippines, or UP, is doing more than the president. At least UP 3 years ago has introduced an elective course for would-be or aspiring journalists or media men that trains them. But the president, yes, he has said a lot, but at the end of the day, cases about killings of media men is still largely dependent on the lawyers and the judges.
The disappointment has come from a position that the Aquino administration has taken, that once a case of a violation against press freedom or against the life of a journalist has been taken to court, that it is now must leave it to the judicial process to bring that to its conclusion. Unfortunately, our court system is not built for quick justice.
It's not that journalists never get their day in court. It's just that they are often the ones in the dock. Libel laws in the Philippines are broad and vague, and breaking them may mean up to 6.5 years in jail. It wasn't meant to be this way. In 1986, after 20 years of the authoritarian Ferdinand Marcos government, a civilian-military coalition overthrew the president. In the decades since the days of dictatorship, the Philippines has enjoyed greater freedom, but, like other post-authoritarian states, suffers from less stability.
The development of the press post-Marcos became a very problematic issue because you had a press getting used to its freedom and taking to it with a degree of exuberance that swung the pendulum over to the extreme, where everyone felt that nobody can tell me what is right or wrong.
However, the occasional misdemeanors that Filipino journalists commit just don't compare to the crimes committed against them. The courts, the libel cases, and all the media murders that go unpunished. They're the big story when it comes to journalism in the Philippines.
He has spoken on the Mumbai terrorist attacks.
You can't have a situation where 20 people hold an entire nation of 1.1 billion people to ransom.
Corruption in Indian politics.
All parties are tarred with the same brush.
Corruption in Indian cricket.
It was uncompassionate to suspend the guy by sending him an SMS or an email at 1:06 a.m.
Even a conspiracy that a bee attack was politically motivated.
Let's say the DIG indicts all these bees. Where are we going to jail them?
But while Suhail Seth can comment on just about any subject, you may ask why a brand management consultant is doing all the talking.
I'm not the only motor mouth or the opinion person or the talking head in India. If I'm being called, there's a reason for me being called. If you have anyone to blame, ask the guys who call me. I'm not forcing my way every day as an intruder into a television studio, grabbing the microphone and saying, hey guys, listen to me.
But here's someone who pretty much does. Meet Greg Packer from Huntington, New York. He has made it his mission to get into the media as many times as possible. And for the last 18 years, he's excelled at it, clocking up nearly 1,000 media appearances.
I like to be in the media because it's a way for me to show off, you know, what I'm doing to my friends and my family.
While he could have done all that on Facebook, it would have meant that news consumers would have missed out on Packer's 2 cents on the new iPhone.
Beautiful!
Or Pope John Paul II's death.
He knows it's God is calling him.
Or the Brooklyn Bridge's 125th anniversary.
It's amazing it's still standing after 125 years.
All events that he said he traveled to specifically to get his name in the papers or his mug on TV. And he wasn't going to let anyone stand in his way.
And nobody's going to stop me, not even Osama bin Laden.
The Packer phenomenon is an example of this peculiar laziness that is common all across the world, even in the best news organizations, in which they need to find a voice off the street to say something completely obvious. If you're, for example, standing in line to buy an iPhone for 24 hours, it is fairly obvious that you're a fan of the iPhone. Why do you need to then interview one person off that line to say, yes, I'm looking for the iPhone 5! Oh wow, you know, I really like the iPhone. The point is that Packer managed to be that one guy over and over again.
Greg Packer's not the issue. The issue is the journalists who always call the same places. I see this myself. After I'm on this segment, probably somebody else will call me because I've been around. That's what happens. What we need is deeper reporting. But what we need even more than that is diversity of voices.
For journalists, what makes the Seths and the Packers so appealing in the fast-paced era of 24-hour news is their availability. And too often in newsrooms, bookers who start out looking for diverse voices end up, because of their deadline, with the same old voices.
You have 24 hours to fill. There are dozens of 24-hour news channels. They all are talking about the same thing at the same time. And if you have to fill that airtime, you're going to go back to the same people who appear to be able to talk about anything.
It could even be you. Perhaps there's a media pundit in all of us, and given the right platform, just about any story will do.
You've been watching our year-end special, a quick look back at some of our producers' favorite features from 2013. Next week, we'll be focusing on the man who blew the whistle on the biggest unwarranted surveillance program in human history, Edward Snowden, the NSA leaks, and the repercussions they've had on the global news media. We'll see you then, here at the Listening Post.